Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Charles Burton. We've visited before, and I'm glad to have him back and talking a little bit about China and Asia, Russia, and what's going on with a whole bunch of different issues that Charles has been writing about. Charles Burton is a non-resident senior fellow at the European Values Center for Security Policy, and he's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he's been for almost 4 years. Charles Burton, welcome to the show, sir.
It's good to be with you again, Brian.
Thank you for joining us. So we're going to talk about a couple of issues. We're going to talk about Huawei and an article you wrote about Huawei and why we're making some mistakes there. We're going to talk about Canada's role in Asia. We're going to talk about a new parliamentary committee on China and Canada's relationship with China. We're going to talk a little bit about what you think we need to do in regards to controlling Putin, I guess, and Russia's expansionary policies, because you think it'll have implications on China. So we've got a big agenda. Let's start with Huawei. Where are we on Huawei, sir?
Well, after a very long period of consideration, 3 years, our government has finally announced that they intend to initiate legislation that will restrict Huawei's access to the new 5G telecommunications technology, and will be requiring that Canada's main telecommunication companies that have major installations of Huawei 3G and 4G technology will be required to take out those hardware and software solutions. Mind you, the legislation has still not been presented. We don't know what it's going to say exactly, but there is no question that Canada has lagged so far behind our like-minded allies in determining that the Huawei software and hardware solutions pose an unacceptable threat to Canadian security, because that would facilitate the Chinese state getting access to information about critical Canadian infrastructure, and also provide the potential for facilitating China's further downloading of databases, something that the Chinese regime has been doing for quite some time.
Now, you've been arguing this for quite a while. Aren't you happy that the government came to this decision?
I'll be happy when I see the legislation, but yes, of course, it's better late than never. And it does suggest that we don't want to fully alienate our main ally, the United States, who had indicated that if we put in the Huawei equipment, that it would be difficult for them to continue maintaining the sharing of intelligence through the Five Eyes intelligence sharing consortium, because Canada would be considered a security threat because of the Huawei connection. So, I think that there are a couple of factors here. One is that the government decided to delay this decision until after the election. I suppose that any government that decides to offend the Chinese regime by refusing the Chinese embassy's very high-level pressure campaign for Canada to allow the Chinese equipment to dominate our telecommunications would suffer the consequences. It would be harder for, say, former cabinet ministers and so on to obtain China-related post-government careers. And I guess the other aspect is that we just had no choice but to make this decision, because Canadian public opinion was so much concerned about China's continuing incursions into Canadian security and sovereignty, that got to a point where the government was simply not able to ignore what people were saying. And of course, I was one of the many people that were urging that we make the right choice on this, particularly as pretty much every Canadian security specialist who was free to talk, in other words, not people who were active in government in CSIS or CSE, was speaking out very strongly that we should not have the Huawei equipment in Canadian telecommunications because of the potential risks. So, it's a good thing that it's been done. I hope that the legislation will be strong enough to make that effective. I personally regret that the government has decided not to compensate Bell and Telus and SaskTel and so on for taking out the equipment, because they had bought $700 million worth of equipment over the past year or two from Huawei. You know, the telecommunications companies don't have a mandate to protect Canada's national security. And the reason that they install the Huawei equipment is that it's cheaper than comparable hardware and software from Scandinavian competitors like Nokia and Ericsson. But, you know, the fact that our government didn't make the decision in a timely fashion has left them, Telus and Bell and so on, in very uncomfortable positions, and undoubtedly it will lead to even higher cell phone costs for consumers like you and me.
You mentioned the political fallout. There were several articles this week that was suggesting that that the Chinese Communist Party and or the state of China had been involved in the last federal election and had influenced people from against voting for Conservative Party candidates. So what do you know about that issue, sir?
I certainly was very much involved in this matter. I was contacted when the disinformation about specifically the Richmond Stevenson Conservative candidate Kenny Chiu came out. Basically, what happened was that more or less simultaneous with opinion polls showing that there was a possibility that the Conservatives would gain a minority government in the next election, you know, sort of midway through the election cycle, on WeChat, there appeared to be a characterization of a private member's bill that had been proposed by Mr. Chiu, which would require that policymakers who receive benefits from a foreign state should have to make that transparent. That you know, if you are in a position of influence towards the government, that you should not be allowed to have foreign sources of benefit that are not declared. Because
what's wrong with that?
You know, those who object to it, including Senator Yuan Paowu, say there are three reasons why this shouldn't be occurring. One is that the legislation was initiated in Australia, the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, to address a specific situation in Australia. So the senator and others who oppose this say that, you know, these influence activities are not occurring in Canada, therefore we have no need for the legislation. Secondly, the second argument is that there's no need for the legislation because our security agencies, CSIS, CSE, and so on, are already fully in command of this issue of people in positions of public trust who are beneficiaries or potential beneficiaries of benefits from the Chinese state. And third, that it would violate privacy provisions of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In any event, you know, we do know, for example, that Jean Charest, a Conservative candidate, had been lobbying on behalf of Huawei. And it was only subsequently found out that Mr. Charest had a retainer from the Huawei company. And there's some reports that his retainer, which extended over a period of 3 years, was in the amount of $70,000 a month. I only heard this through the newspapers. I can't verify that information. But, you know, clearly it would be desirable, if we're aware that people who are supporting positions favorable to the Chinese regime and are also receiving benefits directly or indirectly from that regime, that we should know that, right? So anyway, the legislation was perfectly reasonable legislation in my perspective. But the disinformation that came out at the time that it looked like the Conservatives might come into power, and you know, they, in the Conservative platform, they had promised such an act that Mr. Chiu had been proposing as a private member's bill before Parliament was dissolved for the election. The disinformation said that Mr. Chiu's act would lead to all persons of Chinese origin in Canada having to register with the state and reporting all interactions with China. Well, that was completely false. I mean, the legislation was very specific about receiving benefits from a foreign state if people are in positions where they can influence policy. So Mr. Chiu immediately saw his support among readers of Chinese in his riding, which are significant. There's quite a high concentration of Canadians of Chinese origin in Richmond and Markham, plummet. So I was asked to try and figure out where this disinformation came from so that Mr. Chu could engage with whoever was promulgating it to refute it. And he did attempt to refute it on, in the mainstream English press, and he did do radio interviews in Chinese to try and suggest that he was being smeared. But I could not find the source of this WeChat communication, which was reproduced on dozens of Chinese language websites directed towards Canadians of Chinese origin. There was no, it wasn't attributable to any association or any individual, nor could I find cognates in the Chinese language with anything produced out of China. So essentially this stuff was unable to be challenged. But of course, people who read it, like so much of the conspiracy theories and disinformation you see on the internet, people are inclined to believe it, particularly if it says something bad. And so the upshot was that Mr. Chu and several Conservative candidates who had previously won by significant margins in the previous election lost their seats. We don't seem to have the capacity either within the political parties or within our government to effectively challenge this. And I think that this episode, because it was so successful in eliminating members of parliament who had a focus on concern over the People's Republic of China's malign activities in our country, will be emboldened to do much more of it in the next election because there's no cost for them. Subsequently, they tried to sort of mop up the disinformation by new disinformation that said that the reason that Mr. Chu has lost his seat was not because of any disinformation campaign, but because he did poor constituency work, that his staff wouldn't answer the phone, or he was too focused on Hong Kong and China issues and not focused enough on Canadian national issues. So, it was clearly a carefully coordinated campaign of disinformation that was evoked when it looked like the Conservatives might win and had a beginning and a middle and an end. But we don't seem to be able to make anyone accountable or responsible for it, or to find out where it came from, whether it originated in China or whether it was, an indigenous Canadian thing. Because it served the interests of China so well, one can't help but feel that there's been involvement of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department operations here in Canada. But there again, nothing I can call the police about, because it's just like mercury. It slips through your fingers and you're not able to come up with anything substantive to deal with.
We're chatting with Charles Burton, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, about China and Canada's relationship with China tonight. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Mr. Burton. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Charles Burton. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is a long-term academic studying what's going on in China. He actually spent a fair amount of time personally in China. He's currently also the non-resident senior fellow at the European Values Center for Security Policy. Charles, we were just talking about the Conservative Party and how it was potentially impacted by disinformation in the last federal election. Pierre Poilievre, candidate for the Conservative Party leadership, has made a great deal out of the retainer that you mentioned that his opponent, Jean Charest, had with Huawei. Do you think that retainer, that association, should disqualify Jean Charest from leadership of the Conservative Party or prime ministership of the country of Canada?
Well, certainly, it doesn't seem to have a lot of resonance with the voting population, despite, as you say, Mr. Poilievre raising this multiple times and demanding how much money he obtained, and subsequently we found out what it was, or at least so I hear. I think that, if I was Mr. Charest, I would say, to prevent the perception of a conflict of interest, that all the money I'd received as a retainer from the Chinese company, I would be returning or donating to charity. But we're not seeing that out of Mr. Charest. He seems to have banked it. And I feel some regret about that, because I think that amount of money does suggest some degree of obligation to the funder, and the possibility that if he, once his term of office, if he is elected, ends, that he might return to doing work for Chinese foreign government concerns. And it wasn't just Huawei. He'd worked for a law firm that prides itself on having done a lot of work for Chinese state firms. So, his connection with China is pretty well established. And even though he suggests that won't have any impact on his decisions in government, I prefer that he give back the cash.
Dominic Burton, who was ambassador to China, was, I think CEO of McKinsey and Company, a global consulting firm from Canada, and has had, what I understand, a very close relationship with China over the years. Do you think that should have precluded him from being ambassador?
Yes, I feel it was an unfortunate choice. And now that Mr. Burton has left the embassy, he's again working for businesses that have a great deal of interaction with the People's Republic of China. And he's also on the committee announced by our Foreign Minister Melanie Joly to establish a new Indo-Pacific policy. I just think that while the government has suggested that there was thorough vetting for conflict of interest, that this looks bad, and and we shouldn't have people who have benefited royally from a foreign state involved in making decisions with regard to Canada's foreign policy with regard to that state. And it wasn't just Mr. Burton, but his spouse also did extensive work for China, and I believe continued to do so, at least for the initial period of Mr. Burton's ambassadorship. And I'm troubled by this. We've had other ambassadors who've also got these conflicts of interest with regard to dealings with Chinese state firms. It seems that China, wants to cultivate people who might be able to be leveraged because of financial interests or past activities into endorsing policies that favor that government. It's a very tricky area, as there's no proof that Mr. Charest or Mr. Burton have done anything against the laws of Canada, but I think perceptually it looks bad, and it troubles me a lot. I prefer that we have ambassadors who have China expertise, but perhaps are not wealthy because of their connection with China.
We've got a new committee that you just mentioned. I think you've got some difficulty with it. Is that correct?
Well, I was concerned that it seemed that all of the people who had knowledge of China in that committee have been associated with our current policy of putting promotion of Canadian prosperity before our concerns about China's human rights violations domestically, China's support for rogue regimes in the third world like North Korea, and China's territorial expansion, particularly in the South China Sea, but also through its Belt and Road Initiative, where China is gaining control of critical port facilities. I think there are about 90 ports around the world that have some degree of Chinese state investment. So, I preferred to have seen a more balanced group that included, say, former ambassadors like David Mulroney or Guy Saint-Jacques, and representatives of communities in Canada who have concerns about Chinese behavior, such as the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, democracy activists, and so on. But what we're really seeing is a strongly business-dominated group who have been closely associated with the past Canadian government China policy. And my suspicion is that they will propose an Indo-Pacific policy that will not really be a reset, but will be a continuation of the policies that we've had up to now that are allowing China to use Canadian greed and naivete to further their own geostrategic position, both in Canada and abroad. So, it just wasn't the group of people with enough diversity that I would have suggested. And a few people on the policy forum have clearly been chosen for demographic reasons. Representatives of minority and indigenous communities, but these people, well, I welcome them to the panel, don't actually have much expertise in Canada-China relations. So, I would have liked to have seen just a broader engagement, and I wasn't happy to see Mr. Burton or Pascal Massot, who was China advisor to both Stéphane Dion and Jean-Philippe Champagne when they were foreign ministers. If you want to do a reset, let's get people who have new thinking and new ideas and who don't have any conflict of interest.
It was really quite a fascinating conversation. Maybe I can ask you, Charles, to take a step back. I don't even remember where it was, but, let's say a decade ago, people talked about a McDonald's strategy that said that if two neighbors had McDonald's restaurants, they wouldn't attack each other. And so therefore, there was a great deal of interest in economic involvement in Russia and economic involvement in China and elsewhere. That doesn't seem to have worked in Russia. There's some people that suggest we should have tried harder to have economic involvement in Russia, to try to bring democracy, to try to bring capitalism, et cetera. And other people said, no, we should have read the writing on the wall of who Putin was and realized it long ago. What's your attitude on economic involvement versus your human rights and security issues in regards to this issue of Russia, China, et cetera?
Well, I think, the problem is that we had previously hoped that Russia and China, and Iran for that matter, over time, once their economies became integrated into the international rules-based order, would become stakeholders in, institutions that are designed to ensure reciprocal and just relations between sovereign states. So, the idea was that we'll bring them into the WTO and they will gradually develop societies based on property rights and individual entrepreneurship, and would want to encourage a fair and just and peaceful world because that would benefit their prosperity through trade. What we have with both of those nations is leaderships that understand themselves in terms of interpretations of history and culture from centuries ago. And so they are not interested in integrating into the international rules-based order. Both regimes have ambitions of expansion into territories that they feel should be subordinate to them. So, you see the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's no rational reason for it, but Russia simply wants Ukraine to become a subordinate Slavic state to Russia, and is using economic leverage, the dependence on Russian oil by Germany and other countries to discourage the West for standing for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And in the case of China, China sees itself as a nation that has been humiliated in the 19th century by Western imperialism and wants to become the dominant power on the planet, taking over from the United States and imposing Chinese cultural norms over the liberal democratic norms that inform those institutions that have been of such benefit to Canada as a middle power, like the United Nations and the WTO. China wants to establish what they refer to as the community of the common destiny of mankind, which is a China-dominated institution, and those other institutions to gradually fade into irrelevance. So, you've got basic incompatibility between the West and these nations led by megalomaniac dictators who spend a lot of time reading history books and aren't actually as concerned about global realities and what would benefit their modernizing societies. So, how can we establish trusting relations with nations that are, dedicated to being hostile to our interests as nation states in the world.
The attitude was invest in them and establish business relationships with them and create prosperity, economic prosperity, and their attitudes would change. Was that a
yes, that's
bad
what
strategy?
And I was very supportive of this strategy at the time. And when I was working in the Canadian Embassy in Beijing, I was involved in the human rights dialogue process with China. I was involved in programs to train Chinese judges at the University of Montreal. We even built a building in Beijing for a judges training college. I was involved in programs to encourage the civil sector in China, to establish a civil cancer society, for example. All of this, led to dust. I dedicated literally decades of my life to try to introduce these institutions into China on the assumption that if the Chinese people were aware of how successful they were in Canada, they'd want them in China. Turns out we were naive about that, and naive about the idea that the Chinese Communist Party would be prepared to accept democratization, independent judiciary, and all of the other features of modern governance consistent with the United Nations covenants, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and indeed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that all UN members are supposed to adhere to as a condition of their membership. All of this, failed. And so the question is, recognizing that it failed, we have to come up with a new way of dealing with these nations. And I think we have to be much more transactional rather than playing the game according to the rules set by Russia and China, which is intimidation. Russia threatens nuclear war and we back off from defending Ukraine. That kind of dynamic is one that we have to rethink immediately. And obviously we need to be putting a lot more investment into defense against these rising powers, particularly if China and Russia are able to come up with some kind of union where China's economic power is combined with Russia's military power to try and achieve ends which are hostile to, us and our allies.
Well, it's certainly a concern, and we've got the G7 and NATO meetings this week, and so it's probably going to be topic number one. We're going to take a break and be back in just 2 more minutes with Charles Burton. In regards to China, Russia, economic integration versus being concerned about human rights, really fascinating conversation. Stay with us, everybody.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a really fascinating conversation with Charles Burton. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's an expert on China. Charles, really interesting your views on this economic integration that has not seemed to work and has not brought democracy, freedom to China and Russia, even though we thought it was going to do so. And you mentioned that we should have a more transactional kind of policy with the two of them. We've got the G7 and we've got NATO meetings coming up this week in Europe. One of the big issues I think is that lots of people have been talking about is that China continues to buy, India also continues to buy Russian oil and gas, even though there's embargoes against that, restrictions against that by the rest of the Western world. And so therefore the economic hit on Russia isn't as great as it could be given those purchases. I think people are concerned that people are going to get tired of funding and paying attention to and whatnot, wars in Ukraine when inflation's up, gas prices are up. People want to take a summer holiday and go driving to see the families and friends and the mountains and the lakes. What's the implication of all this? And particularly, I think you have been one of these people that have said the implication of what's going on in Ukraine is far wider than just Russia and Ukraine. It has implications for how China may act in regards to Hong Kong and Taiwan. What do you think the Western policy should be in Ukraine right now, particularly as it relates to your concerns about China?
Well, I think that it will be disastrous if Russia succeeds in its overall agenda in Ukraine. Right now, Russia is able to make incursions into Ukraine because the Ukrainians just can't challenge Russian military might, despite the excellent morale of the Ukrainians and the heroism of their soldiers. Mobilizing pretty much the entire male population to defend their nation. It's been wonderful to see that national spirit, but the Russians could still win. So I certainly would like to see us doing more. Canada, I think, had a kind of lukewarm approach to Ukraine compared to some countries in providing, support, but perhaps not the degree of high quality military support that the Ukraine deserves. And then there was the fiasco of sending a Canadian diplomat to attend a reception at the Russian embassy celebrating the end of communism there, that really suggested that Canada thinks this whole Russia-Ukraine thing will blow over and we can resume relations with Russia as we did before. I think that would be a terrible set a terrible precedent. And of course, if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, they'll probably go into Moldova and other countries. Certainly, my friends at the European Value Center for Security Policy, who are right there in the region, have a much more concerned attitude to what's going on, and very great disappointment in Canada for not standing up to the plate much more than we have. So it's been a lot of virtue signaling, not as much serious allocation of resources to this matter that as would be expected. With regard to Taiwan, I mean, of course, if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, and there's a perception on the part of the Chinese regime that threatening the use of nuclear weapons will inhibit the West from responding, combined with Russia being possibly subservient to Chinese power, because, as you say, China has been supporting Russia by purchasing its energy resources to maintain the economy, something China does not have to do because they can get those energy inputs from other sources. So if you had the military might of Russia, plus a perception on the part of China that the West is finally allying to stand up for democracy and would in fact defend Taiwan against a military attack from China, that one could see China going into Taiwan sooner rather than later, which would also be a disaster for global peace. So, while we're thinking about should we or shouldn't we trade with China and Russia and so on, and thinking about the rather lesser matters of Canadian economic benefit, the larger elephant in the room is whether we are heading into a new global conflict, and who will line up with who. We wonder, where will India be? What about South Africa? What about the many recipients of Chinese aid through the Belt and Road Initiative? Would they support China and Russia strategically at a time of overall conflict? So, I think that one prays that it doesn't happen, but if we don't manage this situation well and send out very strong signals to Russia and China that there will be severe consequences for their violations of the sovereignty of democratic nations, that we could get ourselves into a situation that would be tragically disastrous for global peace and the global economy. This is about large numbers of deaths through military conflict and large numbers of deaths through starvation because of disruption of global supply chains. So, I don't want to be a complete doomsday predictor, but I think that there's not enough awareness of the potential for how this situation may play out in the months ahead.
So because of concern about Russia learning a lesson that it can invade neighboring countries, and China potentially learning that lesson as well, you believe that we have to stop what's going on with Russia's invasion into the Ukraine. That said, Germany is going to freeze this coming winter. You're going to have unbelievable starvation in the Middle East and Northern Africa that's reliant on Ukrainian and Russian wheat. Do you really think that we're going to have inflation? We're going to have high gas prices. Do you really think that just to stop Russia and potentially stop China from doing something it's so far not done, we need to actually incur all these economic hardships?
Well, I mean, certainly we need to do our best to mitigate those effects. And as you say, the consequences are bound to be disastrous. I mean, even if we don't do anything, we're looking at a terrible situation of lack of grain and oil in third world countries, and of course, problems with energy. I mean, Germany is reestablishing coal-fired plants again to try and counter this. But then the other thing is, what if we don't? What if we simply allow China and Russia to get their way? That Russia gets to convert Ukraine into a Russian-speaking country, and China gets to destroy the democracy of a vibrant nation like Taiwan. What's next? Does anyone seriously think it would just stop there and everything will be okay? I knowing those regimes as I do, that's just not in their DNA to be satisfied with that. They'll press on.
So appeasement just does not work. Macron, the president of France, talked about not humiliating Putin. You don't think that's a possible avenue?
No, I don't think that Mr. Putin would be grateful to the West for not opposing his going into Ukraine. I think he would be emboldened with more enthusiasm for his megalomaniac plans. And China, I think, is the same. They just, this is really not a question that we can all be reasonable here. And if we make some concessions, that the other side will back off. It just, this just isn't how those regimes are thinking. They're much more dangerous than we appreciate. And I think that we assume that there's going to be goodwill and good sense, rationality, but history does not suggest that that's the case. And if Mr. Putin had wanted to be rational about promoting Russian prosperity and maintaining peace, then he wouldn't have gone into Ukraine assuming that the Ukrainians would be welcoming the Russian forces or making up falsehoods that the Ukrainian people are yearning for liberation from a fascist dictatorship. It's just, this kind of stuff just doesn't make any sense to us rationally.
Charles, I've thought of you as primarily a Chinese and Asian expert. You've been the senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, worked at the Canadian Embassy in China, have lived in China. You're now a non-resident senior fellow at the European Values Center for Security Policy. Why are you getting involved in European issues now?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of demand in Europe for my kind of expertise. Those countries have a lot of people who have a good understanding of the Russian threat to Eastern Europe, but I think they found that they can't transfer that expertise into countering the increasing China threat to their nation's security and sovereignty. The two don't operate the same, and so in the absence, or at least I hope temporary absence, of expertise in providing policy advice to Eastern European countries like Lithuania, for example, Chechnya itself, and others. I'm quite busy in trying to share some of my tools to assist them in coming up with the right policies to protect their futures. And it's been an honor to do so. I really have appreciated the opportunity to spend time in the Czech Republic and other nations roundabout, and to interact with colleagues in those countries. And, I hope that maybe it won't be necessary for them to import Canadians to give them this policy advice before long, that they will be developing indigenous resources.
I look forward to chatting with you about more European issues in the future. You recently did an interview on Our Canada, Our Future, protecting Canada's sovereignty and security. We've talked obviously about your concerns about Chinese incursions into the South China Sea and Taiwan. We've talked about Huawei. What else do you think that we need to do to protect Canada's sovereignty and security?
Well, I think certainly we have to make up for decades of neglect of establishing our sovereignty over the Arctic, particularly with global warming and those waters opening up to shipping, and the interest of China in obtaining mineral resources from those areas. We certainly have to also tighten up supply chains. The government in the last budget, much to its credit, established funding to ensure that Canada is not dependent on China for critical mineral inputs, which feed high tech, including batteries. That's a great first step, but there are a lot of other areas in which we have to be trying to ensure that we won't be in a position that if there is conflict, that we will be lacking things that we need to maintain our economy and maintain our Canadian production. So, these are priority areas that I think the government is looking at. It requires a lot of money, frankly, and a lot of effort to make it happen. And whether the political will is there to take this as seriously as I believe we should really remains to be seen. But I feel if we don't, we're really going to regret it in years ahead.
Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, expert on China and becoming an expert in European values. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Good to speak with you.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some of my own concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody.